So today we're really just going to be scratching the surface to some possible solutions to an environmental problem so complex, conservation textbooks call it a wicked wildlife problem. So as we know here, the problem is, like in many states, New York has a forest health crisis that's driven by decades of chronic deer overabundance. It's clear in many parts of the state that deer are exceeding both their ecological carrying capacity, so what the environment can support, and their social carrying capacity, human tolerance on the landscape. So this presents an issue for humans through increased rates of car crashes, tick-borne illnesses like anaplasmosis and Lyme disease, and significant economic damage, especially to cropland. This also presents an issue for the deer themselves, as when there are too many deer on the landscape, there's not enough nutritional food for them and they become unhealthy, and high densities often result in fast transmission of diseases like chronic wasting disease. Deer overabundance also has a significant impact on the environment, which is what I was most interested in with my research. So, our forests are supposed to be healthy and teeming with life, with diverse understories, flowers, full of birdsong, but deer overabundance changes much of this. Too many deer overconsume the forest understory, leaving it bare. And our forests, especially in the Hudson Valley, look like this. The understory is almost completely invasive species, and when the overstory trees die, there's no understory trees to replace it, a state called regeneration debt. A national park study found that deer overabundance is the #1 threat to forest regeneration across the Northeast, leaving the majority of forests on the brink of collapse, unable to regenerate after large disturbance events. Regeneration is important in natural cycles of forests and is becoming increasingly important as we have large disturbance events due to climate change. This looks like tornadoes, fires, droughts, pests, diseases that kill mass amounts of trees at one time. Regeneration is also important for our climate goals that rely on forests for carbon sequestration. Because of too many deer, our forests are also losing biodiversity. As the understory disappears, we're losing rare plant species like trilliums and the animals that rely on healthy habitat like birds and pollinators. So there's so many issues because of deer abundance, but why do we have this problem to begin with? And that requires a little understanding of history. So by the end of the 19th century, unregulated hunting drove many species to extinction or the brink of extinction, including white-tailed deer. Financial gain encouraged hunters to harvest wildlife beyond their personal capacity, including through the use of bounties and selling meat and furs in markets. As a response, state wildlife management agencies were created to grow wildlife populations. Agencies eliminated market hunting and actually centered hunters as stewards of conservation through a model we now know as the North American model of wildlife conservation. Hunters became conservation stewards physically, managing wildlife populations through the allocation of hunting permits, but also financially, funding conservation through license fees and taxes on hunting equipment. This model is great for recovering species from the brink of extinction, but not so much in managing overabundant populations, especially so in a changing conservation landscape. Over time, we're seeing fewer and fewer hunters, which threatens conservation funding, but it also means that fewer deer are being harvested, limiting the ability for agencies to properly manage wildlife populations. Currently, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation is the agency that's responsible for management of deer herds in New York. Under this North American model, hunters are funders of conservation in New York, and they're also a mechanism to control populations. However, hunters consistently don't harvest enough deer to meet wildlife agency goals, leaving the DEC to look for solutions to fill in management gaps. So while there are many different suggested solutions in the literature, such as sterilization or predator reintroduction, my research focuses on improving recreational hunting as a management solution. This is primarily because of two reasons. One, because they're an important stakeholder as stewards of conservation, and two, from a policy perspective, they are the most cost-effective and sustainable solution as they internalize the cost of management themselves. One of the strategies to improve hunting is to increase the personal capacity of individual hunters. Most deer hunters hunt until they have fulfilled their personal consumption goal of 1 to 2 deer, And after they hit this, there's no real reason to continue. Experts have called for research into different incentive strategies, especially financial, and this is where my research comes in. The question that guided my research is, what is the potential for New York to introduce incentives for hunters to harvest more deer? So after I reviewed national and international literature focusing on hunter-centered solutions, I found 3 strategies that seemed to be the most promising to incentivize additional hunter harvests. 2 strategies were purely financial. 1, legalizing the sale of wild venison, where hunters can sell extra meat from the deer they harvest. The second was introducing bounties, paying hunters for the service of removing unwanted deer from the landscape. And the third is mainly an altruistic incentive, but potentially also financial, expanding financial support for venison donation programs. These are programs that provide venison for those who are in need of food. To help evaluate these strategies, I interviewed 15 experts from 3 stakeholder groups. The first stakeholder group were experts in wildlife management. These were professionals who worked in wildlife management agencies and deer conflict resolutions, including state, private, and federal organizations. The second group were experts from organizations who work professionally with hunters and would be able to speak broadly for this stakeholder group, including one researcher who surveys state hunters annually. The third group were experts in food security, those who work professionally in venison donation organizations. These individuals were mostly from New York State, but I also interviewed national experts and from other states who had a unique perspective on wildlife management. Now I'm just going to briefly walk you through my research on these 3 incentives and what my experts thought about them. I found selling venison as one of the top strategies suggested in the literature, but because of the North American model, it is illegal in all states except Vermont to sell big game meat. It's a common practice internationally, and it's even used in the US to increase harvests of invasive species. Invasive deer, unlike native deer, are designated as a pest species and not a game species, so they don't have the same selling limitations on them. So the biggest issue with this approach is that many hunters and sportsmen groups oppose legalization, fearing that you're going to privatize wildlife, which is a public resource, and harvest too many. So this is currently illegal in New York, but it's something that the state wants to explore. In the 2021 to 2030 Deer Management Plan, the DEC requests the legislation be changed so that they can explore venison sales as an extra tool for management. So the DEC is interested in exploring this, but what did my experts think? Overall, most interviewees said that legalizing venison sales was a bad idea. It was too effective historically, and hunters would push back, providing an uphill battle each step of the way. Logistically, it would be difficult to develop the complicated regulations to prevent overharvest and ensure food quality, but it would be even more difficult to change the law to begin with. My second strategy regarding bounties was almost equally discouraged. So bounties are financial compensation for hunter harvests. My literature review found that bounties were used as the first wildlife management tool dating back to the 1600s and are still in use today to incentivize harvests of both native species like wolves and invasive species, such as nutria, which is a highly destructive aquatic rodent. Bounties in this case have been very effective in controlling their populations and their associated damages to wetlands. As with venison sales, bounties on wildlife are currently illegal in New York, and they can only be used in rare instances where an animal could transmit diseases to humans. Under Appendix 8, the DEC calls for the legalization of hunter compensation, including bounties, and as they're interested in exploring this as a management tool as well. When I asked experts about bounties in my interviews, most were completely opposed and said hunters would also be opposed. The main issue with bounties is the optics of this strategy. Many hunters and wildlife managers deeply care about a deer's well-being and public perception. Bounties say that an animal is worth more dead than alive and on the landscape. To mitigate this, some mention that we could avoid using the word bounties altogether, but still offer compensation as thank you gifts. Compensation could be financial, such as covering hunting license costs. Physical, offering free boxes of ammunition, especially copper ammunition. Or social, recognizing hunters for certain harvesting practices. My interviewees also mentioned the potential for compensating hunters for donating to venison donation programs. This leads us into our last incentive. This third strategy I investigated is expanding support for venison donation programs. In these programs, a hunter brings their extra deer to our participating processor in a program. The program then pays for the processing of the deer and then distributes the meat to food pantries. These programs provide a unique altruistic incentive for hunters, increasing the number of deer they can harvest while also increasing food security for those in need. In New York, venison donation primarily functions through three different ways. The first is a state-run donation program that services most of the state, and this is through Feeding New York State. The second is a volunteer-run program that services Western and Central New York called the Venison Donation Coalition. And the third are informal private donations where hunters directly give to friends and those in need, or small hunting organizations who process meat and give that directly to pantries. My interviewees unanimously said that expanding venison donation programs was a win-win solution. Sharing venison is already a central part of hunting tradition, and these programs, when accessible, are popular among hunters. There's a surprisingly high demand for venison in food pantries as well. The infrastructure already exists and can expand. However, the primary limitation of these programs is financial. As a food security strategy, pound per pound, venison from these programs are typically the least expensive meat option for pantries. Through my interviews, I found that the Venison Donation Coalition struggles primarily with financial sustainability, funded solely from a small list of private donors, and Feeding New York State could easily double the reach of their program with a doubling in funding. It's also worth mentioning the most notable repeated suggestions from my interviews, and I'll just go over a few here. While selling venison would be met with a lot of resistance, my research explored a novel model of venison sharing that addresses the biggest fears of privatization and overharvest. This model is inspired by CSA's, Community-Supported Agriculture, which I call Community-Supported Deer Management. In this model, communities, or CSAs, financially support a hunting cooperative in conducting local deer management. A portion of the venison produced is then returned to those who paid in. These programs can also support food security by donating a portion of the venison harvested to local pantries. My interviewees presented a variety of suggestions that they argued could be more effective than the three incentive strategies I investigated. Almost every interviewee mentioned land access as the #1 issue limiting hunting today. Almost 75% of land in New York is privately owned, and it's becoming harder and harder to find places to hunt. Individuals are charging hunters through hunting leases to access their land, and it's becoming increasingly common. Interviewees called for state leadership on facilitating access to these lands, including providing financial incentives for landowners to give public hunting access. Another common suggestion was offering hunter education workshops. This could look like improving hunter field skills to improve field success through mentored hunts, marksmanship classes. This could look like meat workshops, teaching hunters how to process their own deer and teaching different ways to use their meat. This especially could look like education programs aiming for cultural shifts among hunters, helping hunters to understand their roles as conservation stewards and the relationship between them, herd health, and forest health. While I make 7 policy recommendations in my thesis, I'm just going to mention the 3 most important here. My first recommendation is aimed at numerous state institutions to expand support for venison donation. This looks like the Department of Health doubling their funding for the Feeding New York State donation programs for venison donation. The legislature could create a new grant specifically for donation programs, offer tax credits to processors and hunters for donation, and subsidizing deer processing in general, which would also make it easier to donate. So all of these, combination of them. My second recommendation is aimed at the state legislature. So the DEC is open to exploring new management models, but they're limited by laws. Therefore, the state legislature should change laws serving as roadblocks in designing effective solutions. Some changes include allowing for hunter compensation for harvests, allowing venison sale pilot programs like the community supported deer management I just mentioned, and offering landowners incentives to allow hunting access. My final recommendation is aimed at the DEC. From my research, it appears that the current approach to forest management is too fragmented across the state to effectively design holistic solutions to the forest health crisis. My recommendation to the DEC is to dedicate new staff positions for this issue. These positions would be responsible for working with a diverse set of stakeholders to craft solutions and design and implement pilot programs across the state that address deer overabundance and its related issues. To conclude, it's clear that there is no silver bullet solution to the deer overabundance of forest health crises. This complex socio-ecological problem requires equally complex and adaptive management solutions. This problem, however, could also be an opportunity. The world already studies New York as a leader in the environmental field. This is an opportunity for the state to also lead in solving the forest health and deer overabundance crises, which is an international issue basically wherever there are deer. This is an opportunity to develop solutions where hunter-gatherers feel pride providing for their communities, meeting the needs of the present while protecting the well-being of generations to come.